So, Chag Sameach, everybody, and Yom Ha'atzmaut Sameach. Good evening, and thrilled to welcome everybody to the temple. My name is Wes Gardenswartz. I'm one of the rabbis here, and we're so delighted to welcome everyone here. I wanted to begin our evening and frame it by sharing two vignettes that happened in Israel last summer, in Jerusalem, at Hartman, in the courtyard at Hartman. And each of these vignettes speaks to the important work that Hartman does, the emotional intensity and pathos that Israel evokes, the crucial work that JCRC does, and the reason we're having this evening tonight on Yom Ha'atzmaut. So I'll never forget these evenings, ever, as long as I live. The first evening was Monday night, June 30th, 2014. And it was in the Hartman courtyard. Those of you who have been to Hartman will know that it's the most perfect place in all the world. And that's not an exaggeration, and that's not metaphor. It's the most perfect place in all the world. The courtyard's especially beautiful. It's Jerusalem stone, golden Jerusalem stone. And they have this really cool light system. So you have red and yellow and orange and golden lights reflecting against the purple gold Jerusalem stone. The weather last night in June 2014 was so perfect. It was warm, but not too warm. There was a gentle breeze blowing. So we're sitting in the courtyard on a perfect night in this beautiful place with perfect weather and lots of love in the courtyard. And Hartman runs many, but this evening, two different institutes that came together. There were a lot of lay people. Temple Emanuel had 40, 45 lay people, and rabbis. And this was a joint session. There was not an empty seat. Every space was taken. And Daniel Hartman was giving a lecture to North American Jews about North America. And I'll never forget his lecture, by the way. The lecture was about, we're not in a post-denominational age. He was encouraging us to live in our denomination, to own what is special about our denomination, to love our denomination, to go deep in our denomination, and to live it. That's what he was doing, and he was making the case in a very compelling, lucid, thoughtful way. And just then as he's talking, people start coming up to him with cell phones, going up like this with the cell phone. And he fobs them off. And he continues to talk about denominations. It's not dead, it's alive, it's more important, not less important. And somebody else comes up to him with the cell phone. And he dismisses them and fobs them off. And that happens any number of times. And he finishes his lecture. And then he shares that the three teens that all Israel have been praying for, who have been kidnapped, were praying that they would be found alive. They were found, and they were found murdered. And then he says, I'm not a congregational rabbi. I don't really know what to do. And then he turns to a great rabbi, truly great, great rabbi. Eddie Feinstein is a rabbi in Los Angeles, Valley Beth Shalom. And he says, Eddie, can you help us out? And Eddie comes, and he asks us all to rise. We're all just found out that these three Israeli teens had been slain. And we all rise. He sings El Mole Rachamim. We all sing Hatikva. And we all walked out without a sound. That's Monday night, June 30th. Tuesday, July 1st, the three boys are laid to their eternal rest. 3 funerals in one day. That night, July 1st, we're back in the courtyard. Same place, one night later. And what had been planned was a conversation with Ari Shavit of My Promised Land. You've heard of Ari Shavit. And Yehuda Kurtzer was interviewing him. And it was an especially rich and resonant and powerful and sad and urgent and pathos-filled time. And all of us, rabbis, lay leaders, were all back. And Yehuda is talking to Ari Shavit. And I remember this. I just remember this so clearly. Remember two things really clearly. One is I remember the dissonant, discordant sound of jazz music in the neighborhood. There was jazz. 3 boys murdered. 3 boys laid to their rest. A nation watching funerals all day. And that night, in the neighborhood, jazz. Jazz. And I'm thinking, what's with the jazz? And then Ari Shavit names it and he calls it out. And he says, that's Israel. 3 dead boys buried. And tonight, this Humanities and Arts and Dance Center that happened to be a neighbor of Hartman was having its spring-summer soiree, and they had it. And they had jazz. That's Israel. I tell you these vignettes because it speaks to a number of things. First of all, Israel is a place of great emotional intensity and great pathos and great pain and great hope. Second, Hartman is absolutely indispensable for me personally in understanding Israel today. I couldn't be a Jew, let alone a rabbi, without Hartman. Because I couldn't be a Jew without Israel, and I can't understand Israel without Hartman. There's no place better that makes Israel, in all of its richness, its realness, and its complexity, come alive in a thoughtful way. Point 3. We all love Israel. And we all have very different thoughts about Israel. And it's really important, super important, to make space in a sacred space for people to be able to love Israel in different ways. And to be able to disagree reasonably and respectfully about their views of Israel, their understanding of how such a thing happened, and what we should do about it. And Hartman provides great prisms and lenses and texts, passages, and insights for how people who love Israel deeply can love it differently. Fourth, of course, it's not only about studying Israel in Israel, it's about living Israel in Boston. And so we're so grateful to JCRC for its incredible leadership throughout as we continue to love Israel here when so much is going on there. During that same period, JCRC was organizing rallies at Temple Beth Elohim for the boys, at Center Plaza during the war, etc. And so here we find ourselves gathered in a season of great pathos with urgent questions. You don't need me to tell you the questions. With the nuclear deal, with our president, with the prime minister, so many questions, so much pathos, so many feelings. And so we're so grateful tonight to have Jeremy Burton, the executive director of the JCRC. Jeremy, thank you, and thank JCRC for bringing Israel home to us here, where we can love it and engage it respectfully and in our own way. Thank you, Jeremy, for being here. And Yehuda Kurtzer, who is the president of Hartman in North America, our teacher, my teacher, so thoughtful. And Yehuda and Jeremy are going to be in dialogue tonight about how, when we love a place so much and so differently, we can all find room in this space to have a constructive conversation at this urgent time. Chag Sameach.
So first of all, thank you, Wes, for that sensational introduction. It is wonderful to be back here in Temple Emanuel. I came here a few years ago, and I now recognize so many of you who are here from your time at the Hartman Institute. I think we're coming in on somewhere between 150 and 200 members of Temple Emanuel have come to study at the Shalom Hartman Institute. And so in a lot of respects, I feel as though I don't live in this community anymore. I said to Jeremy before, I feel a little bit like we are still the home crowd at the Shalom Hartman Institute here at Temple Emanuel. And at moments, it sometimes feels that Temple Emanuel is a kind of an institution that represents the Hartman Institute in North America. So we're grateful for our partnership with you, our friendship, and for your introduction. Okay, thank you. I also want to thank my colleague, Rabbi Mark Wolf, who was the visionary behind putting together this program, who represents the Hartman Institute in this community, and who has been helping us and working with a major leadership role to bring Hartman Institute to this broader Boston community. And in particular, I want to thank Jeremy Burton, my colleague here. We were talking about this a little bit earlier. And the topic tonight that we're going to play with is the question of the ethics of public leadership, and in particular, who speaks for the community, how they do so, and by what authority they're invested to do it. I said to Jeremy, I feel that in my work as a teacher, as an educator, I feel oftentimes somewhat lateral to these issues as they're negotiated in the halls of Jewish leadership. And I'm in awe of Jewish leaders who are challenged by virtue of their position and the authority that has been granted them by the community to have to stand up and take a stand, take a position, advocate for it, and represent the community in spite of what you alluded to us before, profound disagreement and debate about both the substance of the issue and how it's presented. And so in general, I tend to be in awe of the types of leaders who step into those roles. I think we get so caught up in what our leaders are doing wrong that we forget the fundamental act of service that they do on our behalf. But I think we also have to be uniquely aware and conscious of when leaders stand up with a set of Jewish values and the ability to model the kinds of ethics of Jewish leadership that we're talking about. And I want to signal to this community how fortunate you are to have Jeremy in this position. I want to flash us back to 1950. And look at a moment in this question of who speaks for the Jews that was historically important for the American Jewish community and its relationship to Israel, and in which today we're living in some ways in the opposite of that story. In 1950, right after the creation of the State of Israel, David Ben-Gurion made a series of public pronouncements, both in Hebrew actually and in English, announcing that with the State of Israel having been created, one of the central agenda items for the American Jewish community that was supposed to come next, I see some nodding heads, was that the American Jewish community, having helped facilitate this along, having helped midwife the creation of the State of Israel through political advocacy, philanthropy, and lobbying, that now the American Jewish community had to pick up and make aliyah. Right? What the State of Israel needed in this nascent period was manpower, and both literal manpower in the pursuit of building the country, and also numbers to be able to constitute a meaningful demographic presence and be able to secure and stabilize the nascent State of Israel. This is not surprising in historical retrospect. Ben-Gurion was very much a kind of, this is not what this term is used to mean today, but an Israel firster. He was a believer in the centrality of Jewish life in the State of Israel as superior to Jewry of the diaspora. And so it's not surprising that Ben-Gurion issued this call for American Jews to make aliyah. What is surprising is what happened next, which was that Jacob Blaustein, then the head of the American Jewish Committee, now the person after whom the headquarters of the American Jewish Committee are named, stands up and did something that actually would have a hard time imagining Jewish leaders today actually doing, which was publicly disagreeing and debating with the Israeli Prime Minister. Blaustein not only publicly disagreed with Ben-Gurion by saying, you don't get to speak to my Jewish community, he actually flew to Israel and negotiated an agreement with Ben-Gurion of a public disavowal that Ben-Gurion then made about the call for aliyah. And the press release, actually, from September 9th, 1950, from the AJC reads as follows. The Prime Minister's statement makes it clear, among other things, that without any reservations, the State of Israel speaks only on behalf of its own citizens, and in no way presumes to represent or speak in the name of Jews who are citizens of any other country, and that the Jews of the United States, as a community and as individuals, have no political attachment to Israel. A staggering statement to come out in 1950 by the AJC within 24 months, essentially, of the creation of the State of Israel. This means that the allegiance of American Jews is to America and America alone, and should put an end, to any idea or allegation that there is any such thing as dual loyalty on the part of American Jewry. Now you hear what's underneath the surface of Blaustein's anxiety. In American Jews in 1950, right, we still having not yet penetrated the American society quite the same way that we see American Jews capable of doing today, still in the process of trying to assimilate, at a moment in Jewish history when assimilation was thought of as a goal rather than a bad word. Right? In our communities today, assimilation is thought as being a problem, but for American Jews in the 1950s was their objective. What what Blaustein is signaling in this moment is an anxiety to some degree of being accused by non-Jews of having a dual loyalty because of some notion that by Israel being the nation state of the Jewish people, it claims Jewish identity in the diaspora in ways that are threatening. So you hear those threats. But there's two other things operating beneath the surface that are very telling about this moment and telling about the landscape of Jewish life in 1950 that we are living in essence in reverse today in 2015. The first idea that's implicit in Blaustein's position is that there's such a thing as centralized Jewish leadership. When Blaustein is speaking in 1950, he is actually speaking on behalf of Jews in America. Even as, paradoxically, he's telling Ben Gurion that you don't speak on our behalf, he is speaking on behalf of Jewish life in America. Blaustein was living in an era in which, since Jews had not fully penetrated into the social order, they needed essentially their own government. And while many average Jews wouldn't necessarily have known the household name of Jacob Blaustein, Jews who were committed to Jewish life felt the urgency and necessity to essentially have their own government. Right, in 1950 and for several years afterwards, if and when the Prime Minister of the State of Israel wanted to actually speak to the President of the United States, he had to do so via Jacob Blaustein. The American Jewish community was an ethnic group that needed its own political representation. And so one of the things that's very telling about this is that Blaustein sees as his obligation in this moment to represent the community because of a prevailing idea that Jewish leadership is actually centrally organized. As we'll see shortly, that has disappeared in large part for the American Jewish community, or it's at least being challenged. The notion that there's some implicit or intrinsic sense of centralized leadership for the community that can speak on its behalf. At the same time, even as you have a centralized notion of Jewish leadership for Jews in America, Blaustein represents and reflects an opposition that would be hard to find today to the idea that the State of Israel speaks for and represents the Jewish community. So paradoxically, in 1950, you have a centralized Jewish community that can speak in one voice, and at the same time, a centralized Jewish community that resists the idea that the State of Israel can actually speak and function in their names. Today, we find the situation radically flipped. This question of who speaks for the Jews has really been surfaced most profoundly as of two speeches that Prime Minister Netanyahu gave this past year. The first speech that he gave was in Paris, in which he went to mourn the victims of the Paris attacks by talking about being a representative of the Jewish people and bringing that mourning, and it came with a much more problematic statement about signaling to French Jews that they always could return back to the place that was their homeland with a capital H. We'll leave that piece to the side for now. The second set of comments, which drew an equal amount of attention and were viewed as equally problematic by certain sectors of the American Jewish community and, incidentally, by many Israelis as well, the second set of comments were made on the tarmac as he was boarding a plane to come give his speech to Iran. To give his speech to Congress about Iran. The comments that he made were, I am coming to speak to the American people and to Congress about the urgency of these issues, not only on behalf of myself, my political party, and Jews of the State of Israel, but on behalf of Jewish people worldwide. Now, in the context of doing so, and in an environment where not only there is political polarization on the American side between Democrats and Republicans about this issue, but that there are deeply held and strongly held views by Jews on both sides of this issue on the substance of what Prime Minister Netanyahu was talking about vis-a-vis the Iran threat, but also the propriety of Prime Minister Netanyahu speaking about this to Congress in a way that was dissident to the policies of the administration, signaled that Prime Minister Netanyahu was claiming a mantle of the right to speak on behalf of the Jewish people, independent of whether that warrant or right had actually been granted to him by those people. In other words, for Prime Minister Netanyahu, the point was, the right to speak on behalf of the people is not merely something that is gained by a legal structure, but the right to speak on behalf of a people is also a paternalistically legitimate claim. I can speak on your behalf because what I think I'm doing is in your best interest, even if you claim in response to me that I would rather you not do it. Right? And they're all forms of this kind of exercise of authority in which we do this all the time. Most common is between parents and children. Right? I'm doing something that's in your best interest, even though you don't actually want to be doing this. Right? So I'm not merely looking to you to give consent to my own authority. I'm actually claiming my own authority because I think this is better for us, and I think this is in the best interest of the Jewish people. Under the surface of the moment in which we find ourselves today is, again, these realities are flipped. The State of Israel claims to speak on behalf of the Jewish people at moments like this, and frankly at other moments as well. It was probably considered less contentious by the Jews around the world when Abba Eban spoke in the UN on behalf of the Jewish people and the State of Israel, and thought of as being a kind of source of pride for many American Jews, that here our voice, the story of our people, is being narrated. So on one hand, the State of Israel claims today a greater right to speak on behalf of the Jewish people, at least as it's voiced by the Prime Minister, and the American Jews who dissent to that are seen as dissenters to that position. And at the same time, we in the American Jewish community are living in a moment in which the organized Jewish community is merely the product of an entirely voluntary act of Jewish participation. The structures that we have in Jewish communal life in America have no coercive power whatsoever. One need not belong to the Federation, belong to the AJC, belong to a synagogue in order to function as a Jew. Whereas at one point in time, the structures existed for a centrally organized Jewish community that could speak on behalf of the people, because in order to exist, those people had to work through those institutions. The American Jewish community and its central institutions are entirely a product of voluntary act of belonging, and the very nature of a covenantal membership. Since I belong to something, I yield my right to speak about this issue is in decline. So paradoxically, at the same moment in which Israel is seeking to do something, the American Jewish story is radically changing. Instinctively, when Prime Minister Netanyahu made his comments, many in the Jewish community resisted and fought back against the claim that Prime Minister Netanyahu was making, and those resistances stemmed from, I would say, three different readings, or three different theories into why someone would say the Prime Minister of the State of Israel doesn't speak on my behalf. And the fact that they were three totally different readings made it actually a very blurry conversation. What I want to try to do tonight is offer a little clarity on what the substance of these issues actually are. The three different arguments that were essentially being made was, the first, the most obvious, wasn't, I don't think the Prime Minister speaks on my behalf, but I disagree with what the Prime Minister is saying. And I'm pretending that the Prime Minister doesn't speak on my behalf because I actually disagree with what he's saying. That was argument number one. And it was actually a little bit hard to tease out when folks on the left said the Prime Minister doesn't speak for me, whether what they really were saying was, he can speak for me. The Prime Minister of Israel could, in theory, speak on behalf of the State of Israel and the Jewish people if he was saying things that I actually liked. The second possibility, underneath the surface, is that many American Jews looked around and said, since when is the Jewish community, does the Jewish community license people to speak on their behalf with the absence of democratic processes? So until I actually vote for Prime Minister Netanyahu, he certainly doesn't get to speak for me. So maybe he gets to speak on behalf of the Israeli electorate, but until I'm given a vote, you don't get to actually speak on my behalf. Right? And similar tensions began to surface in the community around the Conference of Presidents and its exclusion of J Street now 2 years ago, on the premise of, did we actually poll the American Jewish community to ask whether this organization should be part of the umbrella organizations, or did a small number of people decide that they represent the community and do this? And does that very anti-democratic process signal that leadership is actually not representational? But there was a third argument under the surface, and that's the most tricky one for us to navigate, which suggested that there was something very positive about Jewish pluralism, about difference, debate, and dissent, which would mean that any attempt by an individual to get up and say, I speak on behalf of Jews, misunderstands a core truth of Judaism. That we are supposed to be the people of dissent. We're never really the people of the book. We're more the people who argued about the book. right? And that's why the more significant book in Jewish intellectual history was never the Bible, was actually the Talmud, which is a recording of debate and difference and dissent, and not actually the canonical declaration of rules, laws, and obligations. So you have three different pieces that represent kind of empirical arguments of whether someone could speak on behalf of the Jews, and in some ways Jewish arguments about whether it's legitimate. I want to challenge both of these arenas. And I want to signal, I'll be honest, I don't share generally Prime Minister Netanyahu's political views. We can talk about that in the Q&A if you want. I tend to not. I see myself, apropos of Wes's framing of a big tent, as very much a Zionist, very much a believer, supporter, and in some cases builder of what the state of Israel is. And yet I disagree oftentimes with the claims that are advanced by the government of Prime Minister Netanyahu about what's best for the state of Israel. And yet, I felt in this moment that there was something deeply off about the way the community was conducting this conversation about the right of the Prime Minister of Israel to speak on behalf of the Jewish people. And so I want to challenge that and try to figure out whether we can salvage out of this moment something that's actually more useful for conducting this fundamentally unstable communal conversation. I want to ask whether it's actually possible that Jewish leadership can actually be representative on behalf of the people. It can deeply matter because it actually stands up for things, why we do that, why it matters, and how it should be best represented. I want to make empirical arguments on behalf of the right of the Prime Minister of Israel to speak on behalf of the Jewish people. I want to make some Jewish arguments. The empirical arguments is that it is possible to have authority without the consent of the people. It kind of happens all the time. Right? There are all sorts of authority structures that we belong to, participate with, and identify in which people speak on our behalf even without our consent. Right? So nobody and the American people would say if the President of the United States, even if you didn't vote for him, can't speak on behalf of the American people. He does all the time. I may not like what he's saying, but I've yielded a certain authority by belonging to the polity. Same with a member of a family, an institution, a rabbi in a congregation. It means there may be times when I can change over that rabbi if I don't like what he says over time. I can vote people out of office. But the very act of purporting to speak for the people does not require a constant referendum. In other words, we yield to our leaders the rights to speak on our behalf, even if, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, even if we have to figure out ways in which they do that most effectively. The second thing is that we need leaders to speak on our behalf. We have a communal agenda, and I hope that Jeremy will talk about this a bit. We have a communal agenda that requires of us to have serious representation in the community, and it can't be done on the basis of a poll. Right? If Jeremy had to come up with a public statement in response to something that happens in the world and had to poll all of the Jews in Boston in order to figure out what to do, number one, it would be very onerous, and number two, it wouldn't actually give strength to the leaders who we've invested with that authority to do so, to do something that the community actually needs. So we actually need leaders to function in this way, even if we sometimes resist or feel agitated by the decisions that they made. And third of all, sometimes leaders have the right to speak on our behalf because other people have externally recognized them as the representatives of the Jewish people. The Conference of Presidents was created by Eisenhower, who said to the Jewish community, I don't want to talk to all of you. Send me one guy who represents your viewpoint. And so by necessity of living in the world, we see the urgency and necessity by others who look at the Jewish community and are seeking a voice of the Jewish community, and we have to be able to respond in turn. But I think the more compelling place where I want to be is not in the arena of the empirical reasons why it's necessary to speak on behalf of the Jewish people, but in the Jewish arena. And here I feel the heaviness and the sincerity and the importance of Yom Ha'atzmaut today. And I want to situate this argument on the basis of an important Jewish idea that I'm not sure we fully are conscious of, which is the radical and significant ways in which the state of Israel has transformed what it means to be a Jew in the world. Such that a narrative of the Jews are the people of Hillel and Shammai, who disagree, even though, the law is according to Beit Hillel, the law is usually according to Hillel, but you can take all sorts of dissenting, disagreeing viewpoints, and we can construct little communities and ideologies and identities and denominations that can coexist simultaneously, fails to acknowledge the radical reentry of the Jewish people as a sovereign nation into history, and the experience of creating a nation state for a peoplehood that was once eclectic, but now has a coherent national identity. Part of what what rubbed me the wrong way about the embrace of pluralism as a Jewish ethos in the face of Prime Minister Netanyahu's comments was the failure to acknowledge that Zionism does something very different to the very notion of a Jewish polity. Zionism says to ourselves and to the world that there is such a thing, or at least we aspire to such a thing as a nation-state of the Jewish people. And if we're aspiring to some notion of a nation-state of the Jewish people, obviously the leadership that's elected to represent that nation-state of the Jewish people has to, in some way, represent the Jewish people. We do have to, in some ways, figure out a way to yield our own autonomy to the authority of the representation of that Jewish people. This is a profound opportunity for the Jewish people, a moment to reclaim the possibility of, I don't want to say consensus politics. If you've ever watched the Knesset channel, there's no such thing as consensus politics. It's not about that, but it is an opportunity to say we actually have a platform in which the Jewish people can do more in the world and for the world via sovereignty and via a nation state than we've ever been able to do before. All of our activity prior to the State of Israel is intrinsically local. Well, now we have a platform. We have the greatest platform, for instance, that the Jewish people have ever had to do tikkun olam, to do repair of the world. And so even though paradoxically tikkun olam is thought of as being an American Jewish domestic agenda, the State of Israel is actually the strongest instrument to make that possible. And so we actually want leaders to stand up and represent the State of Israel on the world stage, in the Jewish communal stage, and with other Jews, in order to make serious claims that are possible for Jewishness that have otherwise not been the case. So the bigger question, and with this I'll conclude, that I want us to ask is not by what authority does Prime Minister Netanyahu get to speak on behalf of the Jewish people. I think it's perfectly credible for someone with left-leaning views such as myself to yield to Prime Minister Netanyahu the right to speak on behalf of the Jewish people because something has actually been transformed by Zionism and the experience of Jewish people that we have to reckon with and take seriously. I think it's also something that we have to yield to the elected leaders of Israel because the world community identifies them increasingly as in some ways representatives of the Jewish people. We want to give them the ability to speak in this moment because we want to demand more of them in that moment, and we want to see them as leaders who are capable of making something possible for Judaism that hasn't been possible before. But I think the more important question is how do we want them to do it? And here I'll offer a little bit of a critique. How do we want our leaders to actually do this? If we're willing to yield to them the right to speak on our behalf, how do we want that right exercised? Let me make 5 suggestions. The first is, leaders who purport to speak on behalf of the Jewish people cannot condescend to or detest those very people. Right? So number one, we have to challenge our leaders, whether they're local communal leaders or whether they're national leaders of the Jewish people, to do that leadership of the Jewish people in such a way that it is attentive to the interests and needs of the people and is done as an act of love for the people. This sometimes happens and it sometimes doesn't. When the Pew Study was released, I guess 2 years ago, if you had Pew Study on your bingo card, you can cross it off. You find when I speak across the Jewish community, it's just a matter of time till you hit the words Pew Study. When the Pew Study was released a couple of years ago, one of the damning statistics of the Pew Study, which was paid attention to less because people gravitated to the intermarriage statistics, the most damning statistic was that somewhere between 75 to 90% of Jews in America disagree with the political policies of the current government of the State of Israel, or more extreme, think that those policies have set Israel on the wrong course, between 75 to 90%. And when a number of Jewish communal leaders were asked about that statistic, their response was, my responsibility is not to listen to the people, but what I'm supposed to be doing in their best interest. When another communal leader said, if they knew more about Israel, they wouldn't hold those views. That kind of leadership represents a deep condescension to, and possibly even a detesting of the very people you're supposed to lead. And it won't be surprising if that kind of leadership continues in years to come, that those people will turn around thinking that they are leading a community and having nobody actually following them. If you see yourself as representing the interests of the people, even if you feel paternalistically that sometimes you have to push that community and not merely follow its lead, you do have to be deeply cognizant and aware of the gaps that exist between you and them. Second of all, leadership on behalf of the Jewish people can never and should never be allowed to be about political expediency or self-serving affirmations of one's own power. Right? I know you're laughing, maybe, right? Right? It can never be about that. Now, to Prime Minister Netanyahu's credit, he didn't make it about that. In this particular moment, he said, I feel the urgency of acting in this moment because of my understanding of the Iran threat. Some people were critical and suggested that this was actually, the entire thing was a political ploy to win in the elections, and there's some evidence to that effect and there's some not. But if our leaders are actually willing to put themselves out on the line on positions that may ultimately help them but may ultimately harm them, then that's a kind of ethical risk-taking that we want out of our leaders that signals that this is not merely about winning elections or affirming their own right to lead, but about a responsibility that they're taking on behalf of the people. That has to be a second value or ethic of how this leadership can be conducted. Third, we have to find ways to create stronger relationships or routes of relationship between Jewish leaders and the people they're serving. This correlates to the first. But again, if the community feels as though their leaders are not representing them, then it means that we have underplayed the importance of democracy in the Jewish educational agenda, both for our own leaders to be thinking about, and also for finding ways for people to weigh in and give over that authority to their very leaders. It's not merely about having people who are attentive to the people that they're supposed to lead. It's also about creating an educational agenda in which democratic processes are much more on the table. Fourth, I would like to see a way in which talking about the question of who speaks for the Jews actually promotes this conversation as a catalyst for Jewish peoplehood. What ultimately has happened is that who speaks for the Jews became a divisive conversation for people to say, you don't speak for me. What would happen if we actually flipped it and said, precisely because this feels like an unstable moment, it's an opportunity for the Jewish people to talk through the consequences of our own diversity for the nature of our own polity. Whereas the very fact that it's unstable means that we, as educators and as communities and otherwise, should step into that conversation and try to enrich it with meaning. And the fifth, and I think this is probably the most important, is we have to find ways for our leaders who speak on behalf of the people, whose policies have implications for people who disagree with them, we have to make much more profound an awareness of those implications and to make leadership an act of listening. One of the transformative relationships that I've built in the last couple of years since coming to the Hartman Institute has been with my colleague Yossi Klein Halevi. Many of you know Yossi, many of you know his book. Yossi and I disagree with virtually everything politically. But one of the things that our friendship has enabled us to do is that when I want to think about or criticize something going on in Israel, I first find out how Israelis are thinking about this. And one of the things that I've challenged Yossi to do that I don't think he fully did for a long time was when he wanted to be critical about what was something happening in America, whether it was American Jews or the administration, he paused and asked, what are the implications of this for American Jewish identity? What was missing in the Netanyahu moment was an awareness by Israeli leadership that what was useful to Prime Minister Netanyahu for his own agenda, that is, catalyzing the Republican base in Congress towards the Iran deal, was actually deeply divisive to the Jewish polity in America. And what was damaging was less, from my perspective, the right of the Prime Minister to stake a claim that a particular position was the interest of the Jewish people, but playing American Jews against each other. This felt to me like a failure of the ethics of leadership, of what representational leadership is supposed to do. It also feels worse, like a deeply missed opportunity. Because had Prime Minister Netanyahu been able to make his agenda possible in a way that affirmed Jewish consensus rather than undermined it, it would have actually also been more politically expedient for the goals he was trying to create. The last comment I'll make, and then I'm going to hand over to Jeremy. One of my teachers passed away this week, Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein, the founder of Yeshivat Har Etzion, a religious Zionist yeshiva in the West Bank. Contrary to the fact that it is in the West Bank, Rabbi Lichtenstein and Rabbi Amital, who founded the yeshiva, were both actually very much left-wingers, except maybe until the last couple of years of Rav Lichtenstein's life. And in fact, when I was studying there between 1994 and 1996, I remember the Rashi Yeshiva, and this was at the early part of the Oslo process, these heads of the yeshiva said very candidly, should there be a negotiated outcome that requires our abandonment of the yeshiva, we will relocate to Jerusalem. So they were very much aware that their own politics were dissonant with the fact that they were living in the West Bank, but they were prepared to be negotiating in that process. The most profound moment that one of the most profound moments I ever experienced as a Jew was in the wake of the Rabin assassination. I was living in the yeshiva at the time. And Rabbi Lichtenstein, who was, again, a voice on the left in the Israeli religious Zionist establishment, got up and gave a scathing indictment of the religious Zionist community for its moral and educational failures in producing a student out of that system who would assassinate the prime minister. What was astonishing about this moment was that of anybody in the world of religious Zionism, Rav Lichtenstein had the least amount of accountability for the production of Yigal Amir. He was, however, even though he had the least amount of responsibility for the production of Yigal Amir, he took more responsibility for that problem than anybody else. This is what ethical leadership looks like. Because what it signaled was he was claiming a mantle of responsibility on behalf of the Jewish people because there was a problem he needed to address, even if claiming that mantle of responsibility actually told a story about his responsibility that he didn't have. He claimed it in order to do something that would help lead the people morally back to where they were supposed to be and help lead Israeli society to a better place. So when we think about this question of who speaks for the Jews, the first set of questions we have to ask is by what merit does somebody have the right to make that claim? And I want to offer that Zionism has to challenge us to take seriously that the elected leader of the State of Israel might have the right to make that claim, and empirically that we as Jews in the world have interests in which we want people to speak on our behalf. So it's both a Jewish interest and an empirical interest. But I'm challenging that even if we allow people to speak in our name and with our interests in mind, that we have to outline a series of ethical considerations that have to be taken much more seriously. An absence of self-interest, a willingness to actually listen and correlate to the needs of the people, a willingness to take moral risks on behalf of the people, and a challenge to do so in a way that is consistent with the needs of the people and not their own self-interest. Thank you.
So one of the inherent problems of immediately following Yehuda actually connects back to the relationship we have most of the time, which is an ongoing dialogue on Facebook, where Yehuda will write long, thoughtful pieces akin to what he just did, and I have time to stare at it for a few hours before I respond on Facebook, and then we get into it. This is a different dynamic and a different environment. He's put a lot out there to chew on, so I'll try to get at some of it, and I'll actually come at it from a very different direction, which is much more focused on who speaks for the Jews in a local American Jewish context and not in the sense of theory of Zionism. But I do think that some of the thinking, the ideas, the practical ethics of it overlap, and it'll be interesting to explore that together. But before I do, I just want to thank Rabbi Gardenswartz and the synagogue for opening yourselves up to us and this conversation. I know that you've been hosting many different conversations that hold the totality of our community, or strive to hold the totality of our community when it comes to Israel and what we stand for as a community. I think this is an important part of that journey. And while I mentioned how much I learn from Yehuda every single day in our ongoing Facebook dialogue, I just want to acknowledge Mark Wolf, who he introduced, who is Hartman's representative here in the Northeast. What I should tell you about my relationship with Mark is that probably, I'm thinking back 15 years ago now, sitting in a bar on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, talking about all the ways we were deeply frustrated with the established synagogue structure in New York, and how neither of us had options and none of our friends had options, and creating a minyan of our own, which has now grown in New York to over 400 people there every Shabbat morning from a couple of us sitting in a bar a very long time ago. And I say that in part to begin this conversation. Yehuda made reference to the idea that we have many choices, and one of those choices is about, like, sometimes you get to replace a rabbi. Well, with all due respect, and I think part of this conversation is also, and sometimes you get to leave if you don't like the rabbi. And it's part of this, you get to leave. And I think part of this is, and my approach, and what I want to start entering into this conversation is really focusing on the notion of we are a voluntary community. The American Jewish community is voluntary. You choose to be part of it or you choose not to. And so those leaders, whether it is a rabbi or it is someone in a position like myself, we have as much of a responsibility, a challenge, and an obligation to keep you sitting at the table as you do choosing to stay at the table. And that is part of the ethics we grapple with in our role as public leaders. So let me, and I was listening to Yehuda, and he was talking sort of a bit about the why of this all, and let me back up and say a little bit about why is there a JCRC, a Jewish Community Relations Council in Boston. And I know some of you will be familiar with this story, but in around 1944, when most of us lived in Mattapan and Dorchester and other neighborhoods, there was a real problem in the city of anti-Semitism. Our kids were literally being beaten in the streets, and they were being egged on by Catholic priests on the radio, preaching anti-Semitism day in and day out. And frankly, we were not powerful. We were not powerful as a community to stop it. We were disparate, maybe a dozen Jewish organizations, a couple of dozen synagogues. We didn't have access to the police department. We didn't have access to the local media. We didn't have a relationship with the Catholic Church. And in fact, the way we looked at the Catholic Church then was almost like an enemy to not be trusted, to not talk to. It was verboten. So in this moment of powerlessness, we came together. And we created a community council to go to the police department as one unified community. And we created this community council to go to the Catholic Church as one unified community. And that story repeats in community after community all across the United States in the 1930s and 1940s. And it's not dissimilar from the one that Yehuda mentioned about how the Conference of Presidents came into existence, where the State Department was like, we can't meet with dozens of Jewish organizations. We want to meet with one centralized body. There was an act, a choice of powerlessness in the face of anti-Semitism and powerlessness in the face of not having a way to speak up and make change and support Israel that required us, by necessity, to come together as communities and find a way to speak with one voice. Now, over the years, the issues we speak on through these institutions have changed. And certainly for JCRCs, less so for the Conference of Presidents, which has stayed very focused on Israel and global Jewry. But JCRCs around the country have taken on a range of issues that reflect widely held interests in the Jewish community beyond just anti-Semitism, that reflect our values and our sense of what's good for the greater society we live in, issues that build ties to other communities, and that's a very important part of this, ties that strengthen our own ability to move our agenda. And we've come to see that somehow, at some level, speaking with one collective voice when we can, allows us to be more powerful as a community and to have a greater impact on the myriad issues that matter to us. So the real question is not, that's the why, and I guess my role tonight is a little bit to be in defense of an established centralized voice. That's my job at some level. More important is the how. And this question of the ethics of not just who on a piece of paper the Catholics, the Church, the Boston Globe comes to speak for the Jews, but the how. And I want to talk a little bit about the how in the context of a people. We obviously are famed as being 2 Jews and 3 opinions. So it's fair to say that on virtually any issue that we're called upon to express an opinion, there are many, many views in our community. As someone who is, I guess, positioned as an unelected, quote-unquote, leader, sitting at the center of this wildly disparate network of Jewish organizations and individuals, I'm constantly asked myself that same question. And there was a donor sitting in my office last fall, someone who was very unhappy with a position we took on the Iran sanctions debate, which is, I guess, continuing, who sat here in front of like a half a dozen of my board members and said, who elected you to speak for the Jewish community? And frankly, I didn't give him a very good answer at that time, but it's been on my mind ever since. And I think this question of legitimacy is really important for me, and I think it's important for leaders to constantly question ourselves, what is our legitimacy to speak? And I could tell you about our process. I could tell you that we have about 120 leaders from across some 40-plus organizations who come together on a quarterly basis and talk about issues and weigh in, and we had a fascinating meeting last week where they were talking about Iran and the issues in the coming months, and there were people at the table who said, anything that President Obama decides is a good deal, I will support. And there were other people who were like, there is no version of this where the president's going to come back that is going to be a good deal. And somehow we've got to step back and say, somehow we've got to speak from those 2 places at the same time. That's a challenge. But rather than talk about the process by which we will go from there to taking a position on a piece of legislation, I want to talk about something that Yehuda started to touch on, which is voluntary consent, because that's ultimately what we're really talking about, is a community of voluntary consent where individuals and organizations at some level are empowering somebody to represent them. Now, when we as individuals choose to be part of a community, we're in effect entering into an implied contract with the collective that is not quite, but is also more than what we would choose to do on our own. It isn't the Mark and I leaving our synagogues 15 years ago to create a minyan that was perfect for us. It is choosing to stay in those other synagogues and maybe struggling with what was imperfect. And that is part of staying in a community. And we do so when we stay in a community because we're trying to achieve certain things together. And in the case of that minyan, there were things that each of us violently disagreed on, and we've both compromised. But in the case of a JCRC or a conference of presidents, we're doing so to build power. And now I want to come back to that. Why do we come into existence? To build power together in service to a shared agenda. Now, when we talk about growing power for the whole community, and let's talk about growing power in the context of the American Jewish community, there are a lot of different kinds of power, and Yehuda referenced the kind of power of one person over another in this world. But in a voluntary community, such as ours, we don't need to be thinking about how we build power over one another, but we need to be thinking about how we are building power together with one another. And power with one another requires us to find common ground among different interests and to focus on building our collective strength. And it's rooted in mutual support, solidarity, and collaboration. Power with is both relational and collective, and it creates new possibilities from the very differences that exist amongst us. It emerges from the participants involved and grows stronger the more we put it to use. It's organizational collaboration, and it's what we tend to call today network weaving, particularly on social media. Power with gives us the strength to know that acting from immediate self-interest is not always our wisest course of action, nor that one person or any one group should be in a position to know what is best for all the others. And I will argue that power with can even build bridges across our different interests to transform or reduce a conflict within our community. So let me give you a couple of brief examples of how this looks for us at JCRC in our work, this idea of power with. Last January, France, hypercasher, the slaughtering of Jews as Jews. Now, I will tell you that we at JCRC do not have expertise in the dilemmas of European Jewry, although we talk about it a lot. But there was a need for our community to come together, which we did, but there was an action involved. And the action was not about JCRC staff dropping everything for 2 days to organize a memorial service and bring the community together. And the action wasn't about lifting up CJP, which paid for it. The action was actually about building up American Jewish Committee, one of our members. And to have a whole row of consul generals from across Europe sitting in that second row, and to put AJC front and center on a stage and say, when AJC that prioritizes this work is talking to you and making clear to European governments that what happens to Jews in their European nations matters to American Jewry, and therefore matters to the American political conversation, that AJC has the full backing of our entire community. Our job in that moment wasn't to build us up, it was to build up one of our members. That's how we build power as a community, as a whole, as a collective, in advancing self-interest for everybody. Another example, the Jewish Labor Committee. It's not the largest organization in our community, but it is a very solidly progressive organization, and they made a very serious effort last summer to stay at the table, to be a sponsor of the rallies in support of Israel, and to bring out union leaders at the rally. And frankly, unions are very important in Boston. They also have very deep ties to the new mayor of Boston, Mayor Walsh, who is himself a former union leader. So it matters to us to build up the Jewish Labor Committee, not just their choosing to be part of a communal act, which they weren't always necessarily happy with every word that was said on that stage, but to build them up and then take actions both in public and in private, where the Jewish community weighs in on issues of unions, and so that union leaders know that the Jewish Labor Committee can deliver a community that those unions perceive as powerful. And in return, the Jewish Labor Committee can deliver some of those unions and their power to our collective interest and solidarity with Israel. And I'll just give one last example for now, and I can offer some more later, which is this question of our diverse and diffuse and conflicted and all over the map Jewish community, and the idea that the pro-Israel community has a wide difference of views and a range of perspectives, and the challenge we're having internally in the Jewish community to have conversations about it. We're having challenges internally, there's also a challenge externally. And by having a place where we can hold that difference, by having network organizations like JCRC where a J Street and a ZOA and a Camera and an APAC and a Hadassah and Workman's Circle and so on and so forth can all sit at one table and come to a meeting to talk about support for Israel and talk about the complexity of their views respectfully, that gives us the tools to then go out into the non-Jewish community, into the broader audience, and have complex conversations with people who need some permission to struggle with Israel before they can come around to being supportive of our primary agendas with Israel. And that is part of the power of a network that values its differences and is willing to navigate those differences. So power with is a powerful idea of what a Jewish community has the potential to do. It's a vision that means that we are being part of something bigger than ourselves, in which each of us gives up a little bit of ourselves to be part of the whole. And with that also comes the expectation that the community has a contract with each of us as individuals. So to answer that donor's question, he and everyone who participates in the organized Jewish community, directly or indirectly, chooses our leaders. He does so because he supports 3 of our member organizations, and even though sometimes I drive him bonkers, he's a donor to 3 different organizations that believe at some level in participating in collective power. And in return, those organizations and 40 others elect our board, which hires me. So he has a role by supporting these organizations that believe in this collective enterprise in choosing the leaders of that. It's not democratic like Israel. That's a different conversation, but it is a process, it's a transparent process, and we can make it known better. And in turn, our responsibility, and I would say in this case my responsibility every day, is actually to earn the right to act as a leader. I have to earn his participation voluntarily in a community, and I have to earn his permission to speak on behalf of this entire organized Jewish community. And that means leaders like myself have to be actively listening to each and every one of our community's members. We need to be making thoughtful judgments about where the voice of the whole needs to be heard as a whole, and frankly, where it's enough, and sometimes in our community's interest, to hold ourselves back and say it's enough to make sure that the multiplicity of voices are heard, or that one of the voices is heard. It's enough to step back and say, we don't need to lead on this AJC, J Street, Jewish Labor Committee, APAC, somebody else is leading. Or you know what, it's even better to sit back and say there are all these different voices leading. It's important to constantly look at ourselves and at myself and ask, am I doing this because I care about it? Or am I doing it because it advances the values, interests, and priorities of the collective? Is this action both building and using the power of our community in service to our reasons for being together? If Zionism in the state of Israel, as Yehuda was talking about, established an elective democratic system for choosing its leaders for a part of our people, and to act powerfully in the spirit of tonight, that the state of Israel is there to be a powerful defense that we can take care of ourselves, then the cultivation for those of us not in the state of Israel, of these networks, our own voluntary participatory systems where leaders are committed to power with, together, each other, then we can continue to be an effective and consensual kind of community to take collective action in support of Israel and in support of all of our priorities. I want to close with just one thought about something Yehuda mentioned, which is this notion of the stronger relationship between leaders and the community. It's impossible to poll everybody, but it is very possible to really build a network of leaders who who are in constant conversation with all facets of the community. And some of you who are my board members in the room have heard me tell this joke. Not a week goes by that I don't meet somebody in our community who tells me the words, "Everyone agrees with me that," fill in the blank. And somewhere else that week, somebody says to me, "Everyone agrees with me that," fill in the blank, the opposite. That's the nature of our community. But if we build a strong network, not just of the leader you see, whether it's myself at the top of a JCRC or some other organization, but all of the leaders within the boards, the networks, the synagogue boards, the community, and if we open up public conversation, because 10 years ago even, maybe even 5 years ago, this was all done in the back room. You wouldn't know who the leaders necessarily were who were purporting to speak on your behalf, and you wouldn't know what we were saying to your senators, to your governor, the topics, the issues, and how we were arriving at that. So part of the job today, I think, is to open up that conversation between those of us who claim to speak for you and you. And I think that we are in an era with social media that we have an incredibly powerful tool to do that. And so the ability to go online and have that conversation with Yehuda every day, in public, in front of other people, the ability to go online and say, these are the public officials we're meeting with now, this is what we're talking to them about. Or here are some interesting articles about a big dilemma like Iran or the government of Israel. What do people think? That's inviting all of you into a conversation. And that is democratizing and breaking down the barriers between leaders and, for lack of a better term, the followers, although that's the wrong term, the voluntary members of the community. And that's how we create a stronger community going forward. Thank you.
So before we open up to, is the mic on? Is the mic on? Before we open up for questions, and we do want to have questions and conversation, I do want to offer one response and then give you an opportunity to respond, which is kind of a lateral issue to what you were talking about, but it's very hard not to be struck by the constant use of the word power. And the framework, I think, of power with is very useful. So it's not power that's being exercised over others, but power that the community accumulates by virtue of the kind of network, building of kind of networks that you're talking about. But here's a kind of moment in Jewish history that we're living in that I'm also struggling with the use of that terminology. When in 1944,
he wrote about it on Facebook last week.
Well, maybe. When in 1944, Jews are at the lowest point in their own powerlessness in their history. Right? And this is kind of the bizarre reality that we live in, which is that we're living in a bracket generation when we have Jews still alive who lived through the lowest moments in Jewish powerlessness in our history, and it's a long history, and we're also alive at the moments of greatest power that the Jewish people have ever had. So we're kind of negotiating this problem with these two moments simultaneously. When we talk about When Jews in 1944 talked about building coalitions and consensus in order to be able to create power for themselves, it was a fantasy of the powerless. And when the powerless fantasize about power, it's actually a fundamentally ethical condition, because powerlessness is unethical. When people don't have power and agency to do their own thing, that's an unethical condition because it involves their own loss, they get killed as a result of their powerlessness. Right? Jews not having power prior to the state of Israel was not some lofty ethical reality. It was a condition that we hoped to fix. And so throughout our history, we have longed for ways in order to accumulate power because we wanted to survive to not be massacred by our neighbors, whether they were Cossacks or the people you were talking about in the 1940s. But when Jews in 2015 talk about the need and urgency to accumulate and maintain a discourse of power, I actually find it terrifying. Because what it says to us is that even when we actually have a tremendous amount of power and agency in the societies in which we live, whether it's the nuclear capacity of the State of Israel and its own qualitative military edge over all of its opponents, all of its enemies, or whether you talk about the American Jewish community, which has profound wealth, influence, and power that's disproportionate to its own population, the kind of fixation on longing for a continued accumulation of power, whether it's from or with, it becomes very scary to me. One of the things that people have studied at the Hartman Institute in previous years, and my colleague Micha Goodman talks about quite a bit, is that the Kuzari writes in the 11th century, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, an apologetic about Judaism. And so he's addressing all of the questions that he wants someone else to understand about Judaism. And there's one place where he runs aground. And when you write an apologetic and you stump yourself, you really have a problem because you can clean it up in the editing. But it means that Yehuda Halevi really didn't know the answer to his own question. And the answer to his own question he didn't know was that the king says to him, "You Jews are very morally pristine because you've never been tested with power. But when you're tested with power, you're going to be as bad as everybody else." And Halevi, writing the book, is silent. He's stumped because he can't answer the question. He says, maybe you're right. Maybe we are going to be as bad as everybody else. So it scares me a little bit. I'd love to hear you reflect on this a little bit. It scares me to talk about a narrative, a continued narrative of a fixation with and an accumulation of power for Jews in the present in a way that doesn't acknowledge the difference between Jewish power in 2015 and Jewish power in 1944. In other words, is that continued longing for power now the playing out of a fantasy which, when it's actually accompanied with power, doesn't it yield almost by necessity violent results?
Okay. Is the mic on? Okay. I think there's something in there let me just say up front, I totally and absolutely agree with you, which is this question that maybe we will be as bad as everyone else when we have power. And that is... Can't hear? Is that better? So, there we go. I do think this question, like the point you made that maybe when we have power we will be as bad as everyone else, is a very real and legitimate concern. And I think it is one of the great challenges that when we finally have a state of our own and a state in which, to use some of its founders, was to be a normal state like any other, what the role of a normal state like every other with actual power of a state, but living in somehow as a light unto the nations or living the Jewish ideals of what power looks like, there are real fears and anxieties and concerns about that. And there's a real question in there about our role participating in the formation and development of that state's use of power and the role which we as Jews and supporters of that state around the world play, whether to support its use of power in responsible or irresponsible ways. And that is a huge dilemma, and there's complexity there around our agency in the direction of the state of Israel and our agency in the choices it makes when we're not voting for its government and we're not there, and we don't need to go through all the lingo that people and organizations use. But I want to talk about in the context that I talked about it, which is about our power as American Jews. And one of the challenges, and I get frustrated sometimes when this conversation about anxiety about power comes up. I understand the anxiety about the abuse of power, but power is an actuality in the world we live in. And if we choose to be powerless, other people are being powerful. And we are taking ourselves out of an equation in which other people are making choices with power and the use of power that may be problematic, uncomfortable, or become a threat to us or our ideals. And I'm going to go back to something, Yehuda and I had a disagreement last summer, and I'm going to reference that in the same context here. During the height of the war, conflict, whatever you want to call it, in Gaza, social media became a terrifying place. The level of the discourse about what was going on in Gaza was absolutely awful across the political spectrum. And Yehuda made the case that at least for one day, on the 17th of Tammuz, on the fast, we should all take a Facebook fast and we should be silent. And I disagreed. And we had a very respectful public disagreement, and oddly somehow the fact that we had a respectful public disagreement became a story. But my disagreement, and it's the same disagreement I have here, is like, if we choose to be absent from the public conversation, particularly people like Yehuda, and hopefully like myself, who are trying to have a responsible conversation in public about the war in Gaza, we were leaving that entire space to those who were going to have an irresponsible conversation. And I think the same question comes up around power as an axiom in this world. And it's, frankly, and I come out of the world of organizing, where people struggle with this idea of power. There's a very progressive idea to be uncomfortable about power, because power must be one over the other. Power must be abusive. Power is inherently something where one group controls another. But I believe, as I said, there's other kinds of power. And it's not about being afraid to embrace power. It's about embracing the right kinds of power in collaborative ways, in supportive ways, in ways that frankly build more power than currently exists. And so I think if we approach it in that context, we cannot afford to be afraid of power. There are other forces in this country. Let's forget about Israel for a second. There are other forces in this country that we are uncomfortable with. There are other people who are willing to impose power, whether that's financial power in the campaign process, or it's political power that lifts up one people or another in terms of voting. We can't afford to say, oh, we have discomfort with power, so we're going to absent ourselves from that work.
Is this on? Okay, so I want to say thank you to Yehuda and to Jeremy. Fabulous, really, really thought-provoking and inspiring and interesting. And now I want to open it up to questions from this group because we're all sitting here, I think, in awe of all of your words and of your message. Before I do that, let me quickly introduce myself. My name is Amy Klein. I am a board member here at Temple Emanuel. I'm also a board member for the Shalom Hartman Institute, which I'm very, very proud of. And here at Temple Emanuel, I, along with Wes and with my husband Brian, champion all things Hartman, and will travel to the Hartman Institute again this summer for our 5th visit to the Community Leadership Program at the end of June, and we're really looking forward to it. The first question, I want to open up everything, as I said, to questions. I want to begin with the first. So we're in a community and in a synagogue that is dealing with all the diversity in the Jewish world. And there's a lot of hurt around the diversity and the difference of opinion in the Jewish world and in our very own community. And the question is there any healing to be done around all this hurt and all this divisiveness? And if so, how would we promote healing as a shul and as individuals in our community? And I leave that to both of you to answer.
So first of all, one of the things that I've admired about Temple Emanuel for a long time, and I've shared this with you, Wes, and with Amy as well, is the framework of the 7 gates of Temple Emanuel, which is actually a model for rethinking a congregational approach, right? If synagogues once upon a time served one particular function, and people are not interested in that function anymore, the synagogue dies. But if a synagogue or a congregation can manage to reframe itself in such a way that it says, here are a lot of different points of access, and we want all people to be able to participate in this community, it's a synagogue translating itself essentially as a kind of spiritual community center. And it provides opportunities for people to engage in all variety of different ways. I remember one of the times I was here a couple of years ago, somebody said to me, you know, it's so disappointing. We have 100 people who come for the Torah study in the morning before the service on Saturday morning, but then all of them leave before they come, or most of them, many of them leave before services themselves. And I said, don't be disappointed. You've actually created something in which people have multiple different points of access, and most synagogues in America would be envious, both of the turnout for the Torah study, as well as, if the turnout for the Torah study was the service attendance of most congregations in America, they'd be doing better than they are today. The reason I'm mentioning that is because, and I was talking to someone about it this morning, I think debate about politics is actually, whether or not we like it, one of the gates of entry, or portals of entry, to how people see themselves as being Jews. And I think it would be a mistake for communities that have serious convening power in the Jewish community, like this one, to forego serious debates around political issues in these communities because we actually can't create consensus around it. You already don't create consensus around people's attitudes and loyalties. Moreover, right, the whole challenge of the State of Israel today is that we not allow the State of Israel to become strictly a political conversation and not a Jewish conversation. In other words, we want to try to create a hybrid between our Jewish relationship to Israel and the central challenges that it's struggling with. And if you pulled out politics from what our community is struggling with, you're going to be left with one of your gates being Israel, but it being a very banal version of Israel. If the only Israel you can do is falafel night, you're not engaging seriously with what actually Israelis are debating in the Jewish public square. So I want to first of all say that this conversation matters, and politics matter as part of the discourse of being Jewish and should be brought into, in appropriate and responsible ways, a community that can still manage diversity. But the second piece is appropriate and responsible. Just because someone holds a particular political view on the right or the left doesn't mean that every way in which those political views should be articulated are appropriate in general in the world for human beings, much less in the context of a synagogue. So how do we find ways to locate the types of voices and speakers who can be heard across the community because they're speaking about their politics in a way that's hearable, that respects and tolerates disagreement and dissent with those viewpoints, and that at the same time puts a serious position on the table? I said to a friend who was talking to me about this, there's all sorts of speakers that you never want to go, you don't want to go hear because you disagree with them. And part of the reason I think it's actually valuable for a synagogue to bring in strongly held views in different places is also because it's a little bit like letting the steam out of a pressure cooker. If people hear their viewpoints being expressed in the synagogue, it makes them feel that their viewpoints are okay. So you don't have to show up just to everything if you disagree with it, because it's actually helping other people in the congregation feel dignified. But I think synagogue and its religious and communal leadership has to focus less on the question of the why and more on the how. If you want those voices to be heard, is it being done in a way that actually correlates to the ethics of what building community is about? Would you allow someone to express political viewpoints in a way that's different than how you would allow someone to speak about the Torah portion? Or do you challenge your speakers to present diverse viewpoints, serious, valued, values-based viewpoints in a way that not only can be heard more effectively by the congregation, but also reflects the larger overarching values of the community you're trying to create?
There are several things I want to sort of put on the table here. And you said something about all the diversity in the Jewish world in this congregation. And I think we should all sort of just do a little bit of a spot check that we don't hold all the diversity of the Jewish world in these conversations in our own spaces. For example, we at JCRC, we self-define that you have to support the existence of a state of Israel. And there is some, maybe minuscule portion, but it is a portion of Jews in Boston who don't believe that. And we choose to exclude them from certain tables and conversations. And I suspect that at most synagogues in Boston, certainly most synagogues I talk to, if those people are there, they certainly don't feel comfortable saying that. So I think we just need to be careful in our self-definitions in having these conversations, that we aren't all the diversity in the Jewish world. We are all the diversity in the pro-Israel world, or all the diversity in those Jews who are committed to a Jewish national idea, which includes a Jewish state. It's a slightly narrower definition, but we need to own it and be accurate about it. Now, I will say about politics, I know there are a lot of people who are anxious about politics, and I live and breathe politics, it's my blood. Every conversation is actually politics. And I think part of how we get to a better understanding about this is that all of our discussions about Israel, about anything, are about politics. The conversation about what to serve at the Kiddush is about politics, because we're talking about values. They may be values of inclusion or values of, ideas about responsibility to our children or to others or the world or the ecology. Those come up around the Kiddush conversation, right? So they're about values, they're about ideas, they're about hopes. They're also about how we understand the world around it and our relationship to it. Virtually every conversation has some of that in them, and therefore virtually every conversation is about politics. Now, why do I say it that way? Because the conversation about the politics when it comes to us and Israel doesn't need to be about politics. It can be about our values, our hopes, our ideas, and how we understand the world around us and our relationship to Israel. And if we can approach it at that level with each other, with a much deeper level of curiosity and humility, we can have a much healthier conversation about Israel, despite without regard to whatever our disagreements are. And that's where we have to challenge ourselves, to not come at it from the I support Bibi or I support President Obama or whatever, but to come at it from the place of, this is what I hope for, this is what I value, this is what I worry about for Israel, this is how I understand the complexity of the Middle East that Israel's sitting in. This is how I'm curious about how Israelis are looking at the world, which is different from the way I look at it in the safety of Newton. And I want to offer one other thing, which is not quite your question, but what I've been sort of thinking about whether to bring it up tonight. And we were talking about it at dinner beforehand. We expend, as I talk to some of my Christian colleagues who look at us and watch our conversation, You would think we are the most profoundly powerful, secure, we got it all going on community on the planet, the American Jewish community. Why? Because we have the capacity to spend so much energy throwing our own people out of our community. We spend so much time and energy arguing about who fits in the Jewish community, who's invited, who's not invited, who gets to speak, who doesn't get to speak. It's remarkable to me. Tomorrow night, the CEOs of two national Jewish organizations, New Israel Fund and J Street, will be speaking in discussion here in Boston. And somewhere between 11 p.m. last night and 7 a.m. this morning, piles of email threads and listservs started piling up with, this is outrageous, these people are anti-Israel, these people are anti-Zionist. Now, I have my disagreements with NIF, and I have my disagreements with J Street, and I have my disagreements probably with all 42 member organizations of ours. But we are not exactly a big community. And the amount of energy we spend in this conversation about politics in Israel into defining who's out of the tent, if we spend half that energy thinking about how we do more to build strong connection to Israel, we would be a much stronger community for it.
Thank you. Questions?
You talk about, there's much discussion, obviously, in American society about citizens united and the role of money and influence in policy. Can you discuss how money, for example, influences who speaks for us?
Anyway, I'm going to take this, and I'm going to get myself into more trouble, and I'm going to talk about Hillel. I'm going to talk about Hillel, and I'm going to talk about Hillel in the J Street conference. So those of you who missed it, last month at the J Street conference, the CEO of Hillel was invited to speak. He agreed to speak, and then at some later point prior to the conference, he announced he wasn't speaking, and he cited a particular speaker who was a Palestinian as his reason for not speaking. Okay, that was his choice. It is no secret amongst Jewish communal professionals that there were certain Hillel donors who called him up and said, if you speak at this conference, you will lose your funding from us. And that was part of his decision. This is not a secret. It's maybe not explicit in public, but it's out there and we all know it. I think part of our job, and this goes to what is our job as leaders, is to actually educate people and take them on a journey with us to understand the strategy for what we do, to understand the reasons for why we do it, to understand the value of doing what we do as organizations. And I think it's the responsibility of every Jewish leader to be willing to have tough conversations with our donors. Now, there are going to be some donors who are just not going to like what JCRC does and choose not to support it, and that's their right because we are a voluntary community. But if you're choosing to voluntarily give and support organizations, it's also our responsibility to be in a relationship with you as a donor that involves education. And I can tell you for certain, I regularly get calls or emails, especially at 5:30 in the morning, it's a theme, from certain of our donors who raise challenging questions about some of the things we do. And say, why are you doing that? Why are you wasting time on that? Why are you speaking out on that issue at this particular moment? And I think it's my responsibility to respond to them and say, we're doing it for these strategic reasons. We're doing it for these reasons that serve the interests of building the power of our community. We're doing it for these reasons that build certain ties and relationships on behalf of our community. And what I find is most donors who've already made a commitment to your organization and to your cause and to your passion and the particular role you serve in the Jewish community are willing to have that strategic conversation. And more importantly, if there are donors who are not in that place with me, I say, no, kol hakavod. You don't need to be ours, but I've got 42 great organizations that are much more particularistic than we are, and let me suggest 3 or 4 of them that might look more like what you want to focus on, and go support them.
Agree.
I love to argue about politics because I like to have my views challenged, and I like to see how well I can defend them. Most people don't like arguing about politics that way. Most people like to hear their own views reinforced they, my concern is that a lot of the debate about Israel has been hijacked by fanatics. And by fanatics, I mean people who are, to mirror what you said earlier, they're more interested in denouncing their enemies than winning friends. And I see that as a moral issue. We know through our history how much damage Sinat Kinam can do. And can we try to promote greater tolerance and greater respect for each other by treating it as a moral issue? Looking to our clergy, among others, to remind us that part of being a people is treating each other with respect, and that means listening to another person even when you strongly disagree with them, actually listening to them.
I'll just say we at Hartman have been engaged in a process over the past year to put out the third installation of our curriculum called I Engage, which is a Jewish values curriculum for rabbis and congregations to talk and study Israel in a way that addresses the major issues, but via a lens of Jewish values. And we've put out two of these curricula, contrary to the popular notion that rabbis can't talk about Israel and synagogues won't. They've gone into 400 synagogues across the country on 40 college campuses. Just there is a thirst for real serious content if it's done right. In the past year, we took on to make the third topic of our I Engage series, Jewish values and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Pretty much kind of impossible. Right, and we did it by committee. Right, there were 8 of us with very different political attitudes trying to create a curriculum around this. And initially, we tried to figure out what's a consensus position that we could all identify, because we're not merely a descriptive educational institution. We're also somewhat of an ideological educational institution. We stand for certain things, even though there's political diversity among the research fellows at the Shalom Hartman Institute. And we spent a long time trying to figure out what would be a consensus position that we could all agree about. And then we said, this is actually not just pointless, but it's actually not that educationally useful. What we could do in the context of this curriculum is name and surface what are the 5 or 6 core Jewish values that people identify as being serious animating Jewish values that they consider to be authentic to Judaism and that carry over into their politics. And if you name those 5, right, and we came up with justice, big Jewish value that animates how a lot of Jews think about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, compromise or fairness, exceptionalism, how Jews are supposed to act in the world, self-preservation, and I never remember the 5th. Anyway, 4 is a better Jewish number. If you can actually challenge people to hear what each of those values, if played out in full, would translate to in terms of political identity, you might make it possible for someone with radically different political views to hear the underlying values narrative that's animating those politics. And that more likely than not, right, if a person believes that justice is the primary Jewish value above all else and that the others are irrelevant, I can tell you what their politics are going to be. And if somebody believes in self-preservation as a dominant Jewish value over any other, I can also tell you what their politics could be. But if I could take that person and say, how do you acknowledge that your Jewish values are animating your politics, but you now have to hear that someone else, I don't care about their viewpoint with respect to the conflict. What are they telling you about what's important about Judaism that's making them think this way about the conflict? Then I might challenge you to say, instead of having one Jewish value that animates your politics, what would it mean to hold a cocktail of values? To take seriously that someone else has an authentic Jewish narrative that's animating their politics. So we're not that good at this right now. I think it's possible that we could be. I think what's going to require of us is to enter into those spaces knowing that we've been burned before. We're entering into educational environments where even though it says we're going to talk about justice, Palestinian refugees, and the Nakba, right, which is part of our curriculum, that it's actually a terrifying and unstable conversation because people have very strong views already. And to try to use educational materials that enable us to enter in and hear what's animating the political viewpoints of someone else. If we can do more of that, I would say dayenu. right? We're not trying to achieve a serious political consensus around this, but we might be able to get at what you're talking about, which is the dignity of other strongly held viewpoints.
Thank you. We have one last question.
Hi. So I've lived most of my life in Israel and approaching all of my life here. So I can fairly confidently speak for myself, at least most of the time. So I'd like to address the question to the initial point that you made, Yehuda, around the Prime Minister of Israel conceivably representing the Jews. And the initial reaction that I had to that was coming as an Israeli. And as an Israeli, I had, before I came here, and when I came here, I felt that I actually had more in common with the Muslims living in Yafo or in Haifa than I did with American Jews. And I would propose that most of the people sitting in the sanctuary have actually got more in common with their non-Jewish neighbors who live next door to them than with Israelis. So, and if you look at Israeli identity, most Israelis, at least secular Israelis, would describe themselves as Israeli Jews rather than Jewish Israelis. So being Israeli is actually a greater part of their identity than being Jewish. So it seems as though you made an assumption and you took a leap to say, well, we're more similar as Jews than we are different as having different nationalities. Jews from France, from Denmark, US, Canada, Israel. And I wonder whether you can comment.
So I don't know that I made that assumption that we have more in common intrinsically as Jews than others, as much as the assumption that, like it or not, we belong in some ways to a shared polity, right? And actually, part of the central problem of Jewish peoplehood today is that once upon a time, people took that notion of a polity much more seriously, and the security and stability of Jews feeling at home in two different places is a good story that's undermining that notion of Jewish peoplehood. Right? If I'm at home here, the necessity of my belonging to a peoplehood that transcends boundaries begins to decline. And I guess the only way I'm coming at this is saying, I'm not trying to coerce people back into some sense of peoplehood. I don't think that works, right? As a colleague of mine told me, the minute that you try to convince somebody that they're part of a peoplehood, you've lost the argument. It's like convincing somebody that they're your family member. Right? If they don't see it, then they're not going to be convinced by a rational argument. But what we might be able to do is find routes in which we acknowledge our shared stake in something and figure out a way that instead of through guilt or coercion, getting people back into this notion of peoplehood, giving them a mechanism to re-enter into a conversation of meaning. I think one piece of language that my colleague Tal Becker uses is about how could Israeli Jews and American Jews be better character witnesses for each other? Character witnesses. I may not agree with you, but I'm looking to you to help shape the parameters of a conversation in which I want to enter. So for instance, all of this debate and dissent about the boundaries of what can be said by American Jews politically, what if we proposed that American Jews are allowed to hold and advance viewpoints that are part of the Israeli democratic electorate? Right? So instead of the elected government of the State of Israel, it's part of the democratic electorate. So if I can identify a position with a Labor Party or Meretz or the Haredim, right? If I can identify my politics as part of a legitimately electable position within Israel, that's a character witness approach. Saying I'm tying my understanding of these issues through how they're being articulated by Israelis, or the reverse. When Ruth Calderon has a beautiful piece about this, of sitting in an American synagogue and being kind of totally weirded out by the flags. She came to America, right? And she said, Israelis don't do this with the flags. Like, why do you have a big American flag where, and she said, the eagle is the symbol in Talmudic literature of the Roman Empire, and we have this eagle sitting on a synagogue, right? And it's like she said, first time seeing this, she totally didn't get it. And then she paused and spent time in America and realized that this is a vehicle of patriotism and pride that animates why and how American Jews see their importance as Jews. And once she was able to enter into that space and have empathy through that act of kind of character witness, she was able to say, instead of standing on the side and laughing at you, American Jews, for having a flag on the stage, what can I identify as being important to you? So again, it's not try to coerce people back into a peoplehood, but how do we find ways to be character witnesses across the divide?
Thank you. I want to thank the speakers, obviously, and thank all of you for being here tonight. And one other thank you is to thank our co-sponsors for tonight's evening, Temple Emanuel, the Shalom Hartman Institute, JCRC of Greater Boston, and CJP's I Engage initiative, which is Hartman's partner here in Boston. And finally, as I said, thank you for coming, and invite you to our next Hartman event here in Newton instead of in Jerusalem, and that is next month, Wednesday night, May 13th. Micha Goodman is coming. His first book, which was a bestseller in Israel, was just released in English, and we're very excited about it. He's coming here to launch his book. There will be a public forum, and after he speaks, he will then sign the books that you've brought with you or bought that evening. So that's Wednesday night, May 13th, right here. Thank you very much for coming. Yehuda and Jeremy, thank you for an amazing evening.